The United States is waging an economic war on China, and both of the dominant political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have pushed for more aggressive policies to try to contain China. The financial news outlet Bloomberg published an article that summarizes the situation very well. They say that this year, in the 2024 presidential election, in the Trump-Biden rematch, the only sure loser is China. Trump has pledged to impose tariffs of at least 60% on all Chinese imports. Bloomberg estimates that this would shrink the U.S.-China trade of around $575 billion to practically nothing. And it's not just Trump. The Joe Biden administration has also imposed many aggressive anti-China policies, including export restrictions and sanctions. And Bloomberg notes that the Biden administration is also considering several other restrictions on trade with China, including restricting data flows and potentially putting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Now, just a few years ago, before Donald Trump came into office in 2017 and started the trade war, Chinese goods made up 22% of all imports into the United States. And if Trump imposes these tariffs, that will likely decrease to close to 0%. And Bloomberg noted that there are several industries that will be hit very hard, including textiles and electronics. Many U.S. electronics companies will likely be devastated, potentially going bankrupt because of these policies, and U.S. consumers will pay higher prices. And of course, this is coming at a time when the U.S. has been facing an inflation crisis, and inflation would get significantly worse if the U.S. trade war on China escalates to this degree. So this raises the question, why is there so much antagonism toward China in Washington? Why do both political parties want to escalate the trade war against China? What is driving all of this? Well, as I explained in a previous video, which I will link to in the description below, China has become the world's manufacturing superpower. Today, China makes up 35% of the entire world's gross production of manufactured goods. That's to say that China produces more than the next 9 largest manufacturing countries combined. And since 2016, China has overtaken the United States as the largest economy on Earth and continues to grow faster and faster. And soon its nominal GDP, its gross domestic product, the size of its economy measured in dollars, will also overtake the size of the US economy. So more and more indicators show that US economic hegemony is declining and China is growing and growing in influence. And this is fundamentally the main reason driving the very aggressive policies that the US has been carrying out against China. However, it's not just the size of the Chinese economy and the size of its manufacturing sector. It's also because China is now leading the world in numerous key industries that will be the future of the world economy. Specifically, China has become the world's leader in green technologies that will become more and more important as the world decarbonizes and moves away from fossil fuels. And China has absolutely dominated what it refers to as the new 3 industries. These consist of 1, batteries, 2, new energy vehicles or electronic vehicles, and 3, solar power and wind power. China is making enormous progress in these critically strategic industries. And the fact of the matter is that the West cannot compete with China. And this explains why the US and Europe are waging economic war on China. And specifically, what this illustrates is that the Western neoliberal capitalist model is unable to compete with China's state-led socialist model. As the Financial Times newspaper put it very clearly, They said the emergence of China's new 3 and other industries that were developed with heavy state subsidies is bringing to a head a clash between the Chinese economic system, which closely marries state policy and financial support with an aggressive private sector, and the market-oriented capitalism of developed countries concentrated in the West. And by the way, this conflict is not just because Chinese government industrial policy has been very successful in moving up the value chain and creating these very advanced technologies, but as the Financial Times noted in this same report, quote, what has really alarmed the West about Chinese clean tech companies is that their technology is often superior to that of the US and other advanced economies. So Western technology corporations, largely based in the US, these big tech monopolies, they simply cannot compete with the Chinese clean energy products, which are simply better. And that's why the Western governments are resorting to economic war against China, and in particular, against China's technology sector. So the irony is that the same Western neoliberal capitalist nations that have lectured the world about the importance of free trade and free markets and privatization and liberalization and ending state support for important industries, those same Western neoliberal economies are now resorting to state-led industrial development and industrial policy and protectionist policies because they simply cannot compete with China. One of the clearest examples of this extreme hypocrisy is that the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk is now openly calling for protectionist policies and heavy restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles because he said, if Western countries do not put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, China will demolish rivals like, of course, Elon Musk's company, Tesla. I'm reading here from Reuters, quote, Elon Musk said that Chinese automakers will demolish global rivals without trade barriers. He complained that Chinese car companies were the most competitive, and he said, quote, if there are no trade barriers established, they will pretty much demolish most other car companies in the world. They're extremely good. Now, this is extremely ironic because back in 2011, Elon Musk did an interview in which he literally laughed at the idea of China competing with new energy vehicles. And in 2023, the Chinese electric car manufacturer BYD overtook Elon Musk's Tesla as the largest EV manufacturer on Earth. Here's this clip of Elon Musk literally laughing back in 2011 at the idea that China could compete with him.
There's competitors now ramping up. And as you're familiar with BYD, which is also on the West Coast, I think they're ramping up production of their electric vehicles. Warren Buffett owns 10% stake in that. Why do you laugh? BYD is trying to compete. Why do you laugh?
Have you seen their car?
I have seen their cars, yes. In fact, at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, I saw their cars.
Yeah.
Well, they are on a different, tell me why you're laughing. You don't see them at all as a competitor?
No.
Why is that? I mean, they offer a lower price point.
I don't think they have a great product.
Why is that?
I don't think it's particularly attractive. The technology is not very strong. And BYD as a company has pretty severe problems in their home turf in China.
Right.
So I think their focus is, and rightly should be, on making sure they don't die in China.
Now, this is certainly not the first time that Elon Musk has shown himself to be extremely hypocritical. In fact, he has constantly criticized government intervention in the economy and said that we need a free market and no state subsidies. But in reality, his companies, like Tesla, have received billions of dollars of subsidies from the US government. And while billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk like to sometimes flirt with libertarian rhetoric, at the end of the day, when they cannot compete with foreign rivals like Chinese EV makers, then they demand protectionism, they demand tariffs because they know that Chinese competitors will beat them. This also explains why there's such a hysteria in the United States over TikTok, because TikTok has quickly become one of the world's most popular social media apps. And US social media corporations based in Silicon Valley, which all are US government contractors, they simply cannot compete with TikTok. So this is why you're having these McCarthyite hearings in the US Congress in which right-wing US Congress people, like for instance, Senator Tom Cotton, a Republican, have been grilling the CEO of TikTok, even though he's not Chinese, he's Singaporean. The US has been grilling him and accusing him of allegedly being part of the Communist Party of China and all of this nonsense. Of course, this is all about scaring people in the United States to justify the new economic war against China that is bipartisan in Washington. But it's also about justifying banning TikTok and using protectionist measures against Chinese social media companies like TikTok in order to protect US social media monopolies like Meta, of course, which owns Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp, or like Google, which owns YouTube. So this is a way, once again, of justifying this economic war against China because the US does not actually want economic competition. And by the way, it's not just the United States. The European Union is doing the exact same thing. And the EU launched an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles imports into the EU. And there are many reports suggesting that Brussels will likely impose tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So here we see another example of how Western neoliberal capitalist economies cannot compete with China. And this is especially clear when we look at the green transition, not only with electric vehicles, but even more so with solar panels, one of the most important technologies to fight against climate change. And Western countries claim that they want to fight climate change rhetorically, and they lecture countries in the global south for not immediately transitioning to green energy. Well, China is leading the world in the green transition. And now Western countries say, well, if China is going to lead the green transition, then we don't actually want it. We actually don't care about climate change. We're going to continue destroying the planet, polluting the air. And in fact, many Western countries are expanding fossil fuel production, which is making global warming even worse, which is often causing extreme consequences in the global south, where there's more and more extreme weather. So the global south is facing the consequences of this very selfish behavior by the global north rich economies. And meanwhile, China in 2023 installed more solar panels, more solar power capacity in 1 year than the US has ever installed, or that any country has ever installed in the history of solar power. I'm reading here from Bloomberg. China accounted for more than half of the global additions of solar power in 2023. China added 217 gigawatts of solar in 1 year, blowing away its previous record of 87 gigawatts in 2022. And in the entire history of solar power, the US has installed 175 gigawatts of capacity of solar power. Just in 2023, China installed 217. Now China has 610 gigawatts, which is over 3 times more than the US has ever installed. So China has installed more solar power capacity than the following countries all combined: the US, India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, Spain, Australia, and Italy combined. The website Carbon Brief reported that clean energy was the top driver of China's economic growth in 2023. Clean energy technologies contribute a record 11.4 trillion yuan, which is about 1.6 trillion US dollars at the current exchange rate, contributing that to China's economy in 2023, accounting for all of the growth and investment and a larger share of economic growth than any other sector. And this report notes that this surge in investment in China was driven by those new 3 industries: solar power, electric vehicles, and batteries. And the report notes that in 2023, China invested 890 billion US dollars in these clean energy sectors. That is nearly the total global investment in fossil fuel supply. And China's investments in clean energy technologies in 2023 were roughly equivalent to the entire GDP, the entire economies of Switzerland and Turkey. The growth of both solar and wind power capacity in China in the past few years is absolutely amazing. No other country comes even remotely close. And this shows that while Western governments talk about climate change, they never put their money where their mouth is. They don't actually follow up their rhetoric with tangible policy to fight climate change. China, on the other hand, is leading the world in the fight against climate change and in the transition toward green technologies that will be the future of humanity. In fact, Reuters reported in 2023 that China's carbon emissions are likely going to peak potentially in 2024. So that's to say that China is almost certainly going to meet the goal that it had set to have peak carbon emissions by 2030. China is likely going to accomplish that 6 years early, or at least a few years early. I should add that the website Carbon Brief also reported that China's emissions are set to fall in 2024. It notes that CO2 emissions are set to fall in 2024, and in general in China, they could be facing a structural decline. Meanwhile, the United States is very likely not going to meet the carbon emissions reductions commitments that it made for 2030. So let me repeat that for emphasis here. China is going to meet its 2030 carbon emissions reductions commitments early, several years early, whereas the United States is very likely not going to meet them at all. This says everything about which country is actually taking climate change and the green transition seriously, and which country, that is the US, which uses climate change simply as a rhetorical tool in order to boss other countries around. So the US and the EU cannot compete with China in solar power and in wind power. China is leaving them in the dust. And China has also become the world's leader in car production, and in particular in the production of new energy vehicles or electric vehicles. And in just 3 years, between 2021 and 2023, China went from exporting almost no cars to overtaking the largest car exporters, South Korea, Germany, and Japan. And now China, as of the end of 2023, China is the number one car exporter on Earth. And this is a product of the success of China's central planning, of planning by the government, instead of allowing the free market and private capital to determine how industry will develop in China. The Chinese government made a decision in 2020 to create a new plan that they refer to as the High Quality Development of New Energy Vehicles Plan from 2021 until 2035. And the Chinese government, through its state-owned socialized banking sector, gave very favorable loans at low interest rates and provided subsidies and support to these critically strategic industries in order to develop very quickly in research and production. So this brings me to the Financial Times article that I cited earlier. It's titled "The Looming Trade Tensions Over China's Subsidies." And I want to highlight a few points in this article because it's really revealing. It shows how Western capitalist nations that developed their economies and advanced technology through significant state intervention in the economy, through industrial policy, through protectionism, through tariffs, through subsidies, massive subsidies. Well, now these Western governments like the US are attacking China for doing the same thing, and they're responding with protectionist policies against China. And the US is spending hundreds of billions and perhaps trillions of dollars on subsidies for green technology, and yet telling China that it has to abide by free market principles. This is what the old 19th century German economist Friedrich List referred to as kicking away the ladder. When wealthy countries industrialize and modernize their economies, they then kick away the ladder that they use to move up the value-added chain and industrialize. And the South Korean development economist Ha-Jun Chang showed in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy in Historical Perspective, he showed how the advanced economies of the world, including in the US, Europe, Japan, they all implemented these state-led development models, which included heavy protectionism. And then when they became rich, they told poor developing countries to do the opposite of what they did. And now this is exactly what the West is saying to China. And the West is returning to these protectionist policies because they cannot compete against China. So none of these countries actually believe in the so-called free market or free trade. It's simply a rhetorical tool that is used by the dominant economic power in order to maintain its economic hegemony. The classical political economist David Ricardo famously argued back in the early 19th century that every country should have free trade and should trade according to their comparative advantage, and that free trade benefits everyone. Now, in addition to being a political economist, David Ricardo was also a politician. He was a member of parliament from the UK, and he conveniently left out how this narrative benefited the British Empire and the British Empire's economic interests. And since then, several scholars have pointed out, although it's still not mainstream, David Ricardo is considered a god alongside Adam Smith. But a few independent critical scholars like Matthew Watson at the University of Warwick, he pointed out that Ricardo's account of the purely mathematical logic of comparative advantage writes out of economic history the centrality of both imperial wars and African slavery to the early English and Portuguese experience of so-called free trade. And he cited the renowned economist Joan Robinson, and she famously argued back in the 1960s and the 1970s that what was portrayed as the universal truth of comparative advantage in economics textbooks was actually Ricardo's description in abstract form of the structure of early 19th century British commercial interest. That is to say, this idea of comparative advantage was not something that was set in stone in the laws of nature. It actually was, in that historical moment, an argument that helped the British Empire. And when it was not in the British Empire's economic interests, they completely abandoned the idea of free trade. They only preached free trade after they established their economic hegemony, just as the United States was one of the most heavily protectionist economies of all of the advanced economies on Earth until really World War II, when the US established its economic hegemony over the world and basically took over the previous role of the British Empire. And then the US began preaching the importance of free trade, and especially with the rise of neoliberalism in the late 70s and 1980s, the US began imposing the neoliberal Washington Consensus on economies all around the world, not only telling them, but forcing these countries to liberalize their trade, remove any trade barriers, remove any subsidies and protectionist policies to help local industries so they can compete internationally, privatize state-owned enterprises, cut healthcare and education and other forms of social spending. It's a matter of the rich countries telling the poor countries to do the exact opposite of what they did in order to become wealthy. So now I'm going to go back again to this Financial Times article on the looming trade tensions over China's subsidies. It notes that China's Commerce Minister, Wang Wantao, gave a speech in which he warned of rising trade protectionism and intensified geopolitical conflicts, in particular targeting the new three industries in China of EVs, solar panels, and lithium batteries. And the Financial Times noted that the European Commission is currently carrying out an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles that could lead to higher tariffs for Chinese imports. The EU is also considering emergency support measures for its own solar panel manufacturing industry, and it is carrying out an anti-dumping investigation into Chinese exports. And the United States has slapped export controls on high-tech shipments to China. So once again, the West does not actually care about free trade. They only preach free trade when it's in their own economic interests. But when China benefits from trade, well, then they stop talking about free trade and the West resorts to trade war, economic war, and protectionism. Now, this report in the Financial Times notes that developed countries have long grizzled about Beijing's industrial policy. So the US for decades has implemented industrial policy and provided billions and billions of dollars of subsidies for major companies, especially tech companies, and also through research funding through DARPA, the Pentagon's research organization. So when China does industrial policy, then the West criticizes it. The Financial Times pointed out that in the early 2000s, Beijing launched several industrial plans which aimed to reduce China's dependence on imported technology to 30% or less by 2020. And China's industrial policy worried Western governments, including US President Donald Trump, and they were angry about China's Made in China 2025 plan, which sought to elevate China's technological prowess to the highest levels. And they cite a China economist with the Swiss bank UBS who said that, quote, the idea was that China was facing the middle income trap. And so China really needed to move up the value chain and upgrade industry to be able to compete. And once again, as the South Korean development economist Ha Jung-chang showed in his work, this is exactly what all of the advanced industrialized countries did. They provided protectionist policies in the form of tariffs. They provided state subsidies and massive infrastructure investment by the state. They provided very low interest credit loans provided often by public banks, or at least banks that were being guided by the state, to these strategic industries. And then when they used these protectionist policies to help provide local industry, infant industries to develop, then when they became internationally competitive, those economies like in the US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, after those years of protectionist policies, then they lifted those policies and started talking about free trade. Well, for the past few decades, China was still in the catch-up period and was trying to move up the value chain using those same policies. The Financial Times noted that China has provided generous subsidies in many of these important sectors like semiconductors and electric vehicles. The Chinese government also provided support in the form of building and operating public charging stations for electric vehicles. And the Chinese government helped to fund product development, production facilities, research and development, asset acquisitions, and low-interest government loans. And importantly for China's state planners, the sector, the green sector, green technologies, has met its target, and Chinese brand electric vehicles now hold 80% of the domestic market as of 2022. And I have seen this in Beijing. You can see that many cars driving around are electric vehicles because they have a green license plate. And in particular, almost all of the taxis are electric vehicles. In order to have a taxi, basically, to be a taxi driver, you have to use an electric vehicle. And the government has provided many subsidies and support mechanisms to encourage fewer and fewer internal combustion engines in the cars. However, it is not just a matter of government support for these industries. The Financial Times wrote here that, quote, what has really alarmed the West about Chinese clean tech companies is that their technology is often superior to that of the US and other advanced economies. And again, this brings me back to what Elon Musk had said when the Tesla CEO, this billionaire oligarch, was calling for Western governments to implement protectionist policies to prevent his Chinese competitors from basically making Tesla go bankrupt. These Chinese technologies are frankly superior to the Western technologies, and the free market cannot compete, which is why Western governments are now implementing industrial policy and using state support for these companies like China did, but they're complaining when China does it, despite the fact that they're doing the exact same thing. Now, the Financial Times quotes Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor under Joe Biden, and he gave a historic speech in 2023 in which he complained that now the United States, quote, has to contend with the reality that a large non-market economy, that is China's socialist economy, has been integrated into the international economic order in a way that poses considerable challenges. This is a transcript of the speech that Jake Sullivan gave in April 2023 at the Brookings Institution, one of the most powerful think tanks in Washington. And this is the transcript published by the Biden White House. And in this speech, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, he said that essentially the Washington consensus had failed. And the Washington consensus refers to the neoliberal economic orthodoxy that the United States imposed on countries around the world, in particular through the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And still today, global South countries are often forced to implement the Washington consensus, despite the fact that the U.S. National Security Advisor is now admitting that it's been a failure. And once again, it shows that the U.S. tells poor countries to do the opposite of what it does in order to continue to develop its technology and its economy. Now, Jake Sullivan said in this speech, he noted that the neoliberal economic orthodoxy of the Washington consensus led to four very significant problems. First of all, it led to the hollowing out of the U.S. industrial base, and that's why he's now calling for public investment, that is state government investment, because the free market is not going to do it. And he said that there was an assumption at the heart of this neoliberal logic, which is that markets always allocate capital productively and efficiently. But that's not true. This neoliberal capitalist orthodoxy was wrong, and he noted that in the name of oversimplified market efficiency, entire supply chains of strategic goods, along with the industries and jobs that made them, moved overseas. So this is the downside of this deep trade liberalization. Furthermore, he noted that another assumption in this neoliberal orthodoxy was that the type of growth did not matter. And he pointed out that neoliberal reforms came together to privilege some sectors of the economy, like finance, while other essential sectors, like semiconductors and infrastructure, atrophied. And he said that the U.S. industrial capacity, which is crucial to any country's ability to continue to innovate, took a real hit. Furthermore, he noted that through its socialist model, the People's Republic of China continued to subsidize at a massive scale traditional industries like steel, as well as key industries of the future, like clean energy, digital infrastructure, and advanced biotechnologies. Therefore, America did not just lose manufacturing, but it also eroded its competitiveness in critical technologies that would define the future. And he said, finally, another significant challenge that this neoliberal economic orthodoxy unleashed was extreme inequality, which has damaged so-called democracy to the extent that there is so-called democracy in the West. It's very exaggerated. It's actually a plutocracy in which a small handful of billionaire capitalist oligarchs control the political system and can buy politicians. And that's why over 80, in some cases over 90% of the members of Congress running for office in elections who have more campaign funding win the election. It's the best so-called democracy money can buy. But the point is that this neoliberal economic orthodoxy claimed that trade-enabled growth would be inclusive growth, that the gains of trade would end up getting broadly shared within nations. And this goes back to this interpretation of David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage, which is simply not true. It's economic dogma, it's neoliberal capitalist dogma, but it's false. And he admitted that those gains of so-called free trade failed to reach a lot of working people. The American middle class lost ground while the wealthy did better than ever. And American manufacturing communities were hollowed out. And the key drivers of this increasing economic inequality, and which has led to political radicalization going further and further to the right, with far-right leaders like Donald Trump becoming mainstream. And also in Europe, you see the same thing with these neoliberal economic policies fueling the rise of the far right in Europe as well, and neo-fascist movements. Jake Sullivan pointed out that the key drivers of this inequality and political radicalization was trickle-down economic policies, that is neoliberal economic orthodoxy. And he says policies like regressive tax cuts, deep cuts to public investment, unchecked corporate concentration, and active measures to undermine the labor movement, which had built the middle class in the first place. So that historic speech by the U.S. National Security Advisor explains why the U.S. is now returning to protectionist policies and waging economic war against China, because the neoliberal capitalist model has been fundamentally unable to compete with China's state-led socialist model. Now, China, of course, has a socialist market economy. They refer to it as officially a socialist market economy, or they refer to it as socialism with Chinese characteristics. It includes elements of planning. It's not the same as the Soviet economy, but it still is a socialist model. And I explain more about that Chinese economic model in the separate video that I did on how China has become the world's industrial superpower. I have linked to that in the description below. But finally, going back to this Financial Times article once again briefly here, it notes that Chinese policymakers have pointed out the hypocrisy of the US and the EU, which also have massive subsidies for green industry. And they point out that the US government, the Biden administration, passed the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which was originally estimated to provide $385 billion of subsidies, but could rise to $3 trillion of subsidies for green industry in the US. So this is an implicit acknowledgement that the free market and capitalism cannot compete with China, which is why they are now using very similar forms of state-led industrial policy. And this Financial Times article includes a quote that has become a cliche, but there's an element of truth in it. And they say that the US and the EU thought that when they normalized relations with China and began trading with China, and when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, they thought that while they were dealing with China, China would become more like them. But instead, China managed to actually make them become more like China. And this is a very kind of arrogant, condescending quote. I don't like it. It's often quoted in the Western media, but there's an element of truth in it, in the sense that these Western neoliberal capitalist economies cannot compete with China's socialist model. So now, as Jake Sullivan had said, the US is having to abandon the neoliberal Washington consensus and implement socialistic policies, or at least you could say state capitalist policies. And instead of relying on the free market and private industry and investors, instead, he's saying very clearly that this transition toward green technology and reindustrialization in the US, it has to be driven by public investment, not private investment, public investment, because only the state can actually compete in this way. And this kind of essentially a form of limited central planning. They're returning to elements of planning, which is really what industrial policy is. Industrial policy is a limited form of planning. They're acknowledging that planning does have an important role in economic and industrial development, and you cannot simply leave everything to the free market. And the ultimate irony is this is not new. We've seen this happen in the past. Of course, in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, in which the US began implementing industrial policy and had many of these state interventionist policies, these Keynesian policies that were completely mainstream. And it was the Republican president, Richard Nixon, who famously said, "We're all Keynesians now." And it wasn't until the rise of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the late 1970s and the turn toward neoliberalism that the US abandoned many of those state-led industrial policies. However, you can also go back even to the godfather of neoliberalism, Ronald Reagan himself, and he also used trade war, economic war, and protectionist policies against Japan. And in the 1980s, there was a lot of propaganda in the US. You can see this reflected in Hollywood movies. And there was all this propaganda claiming that Japan would become the world's economic superpower. It had overseen massive industrial development like China has done. And by the way, the way that Japan developed technologically and became a technological superpower by the 1980s is also through state-led industrial development. Now, in the case of China, it was obviously socialism, but in the case of Japan, it was, you could say, state capitalism. And this is shown very clearly in the research by the political economist Chalmers Johnson in his famous book on the MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And he looks at Japanese industrial policy and shows how its state-led economic development helped it move up the value chain like China has. And instead of talking about the free market and criticizing protectionism, what did the Ronald Reagan administration do? Reagan imposed 100% tariffs on goods produced by Japanese electronics companies. So preventing Japanese electronics companies from competing and getting access to the US market. Now, this is infinitely ironic because Ronald Reagan was a right-wing neoliberal poster boy, and his famous slogan was that the government is not the solution to the problem, the government is the problem. However, in 1988, 1 year, just a few months after Ronald Reagan imposed 100% tariffs on electronic products from Japan, he gave a speech, a radio address, talking about the importance of free trade and criticizing protectionism. Ronald Reagan said that we must reject protectionism and reaffirm that more trade, not less, is the wave of the future. He claimed that one of the key factors behind our nation's great prosperity is the open trade policy that allows the American people to freely exchange goods and services with free people around the world. He quoted Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, which I'm sure he's never read, because when Adam Smith, the classical political economist, was talking about free trade, he meant free trade free of economic rent, free of the feudal landlords that had dominated before the rise of capitalism. His idea of free trade was not the free trade that we hear from these neoliberal propagandists. So, of course, these neoliberal dogmatists, they never actually read Adam Smith. But anyway, the point is that Ronald Reagan invoked Adam Smith talking about the folly of protectionism. And Ronald Reagan said that over the past 200 years, not only has the argument against tariffs and trade barriers won nearly universal agreement among economists, but it has also proven itself in the real world, where we have seen free trading nations prosper while protectionist countries fall behind. Reagan said that a few months after putting 100% tariffs on Japanese electronic goods. So the reason I keep stressing this point is that no one actually believes in this myth of free trade and the free market and even comparative advantage. This is the propaganda that neoliberal sophists, mainstream neoclassical economists at institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, or these right-wing think tanks and libertarian think tanks, this is the propaganda that they try to tell poor countries that they should implement. Meanwhile, every single advanced, developed, industrialized economy did not develop through free trade and liberalization. They developed through significant protectionism and state support for infant industries, all of the policies that China has used to economically develop. And now that the West can no longer compete, they're simply abandoning this farce, this idea that they care about free trade, and going back to their protectionist history, which they have done countless times throughout history. So this explains the real reasons behind the economic war against China. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. If you like the work that we do here, please like and subscribe if you're watching this video on YouTube. And if you prefer listening to this as a podcast, you can check out the Geopolitical Economy Report podcast. Every episode is available as both a video and also as an audio-only podcast. And if you appreciate the work that we do, also please consider supporting us. We're completely independent. You can donate in several ways if you go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support. The best way is you can go to patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy and become a patron to help sustain our work. We are completely independent. We have no institutional support. We rely entirely on small donations from viewers and listeners like you. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining me. I will see you next time.